Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome you on the morning of the third day of our conference, unfortunately already the last day of the conference, but well, I think that's developing pretty well and we're looking forward to the papers to come. And now it's an exceptional pleasure for me to introduce James Mensch. James is a professor of philosophy at the Faculty of Humanities in Prague, Czech Republic, where he teaches phenomenology and philosophy. I think for you it doesn't make such a big difference at some point. He has very many research areas, has written more than a dozen of monographs, if I remember rightly. 13, okay. I think the last, to start with that, was the intertwining, a book on the intertwining, this concept of Merleau-Ponty that he unfolds and applies to a variety of topics and phenomena that also relate to the practical world. And I say this because I think that's one of the foremost and impressive things James is doing. He's applying phenomenology. He wrote some books on towering figures in phenomenology, of course on Husserl. He wrote commentary on Levinas, but he also writes on topics, and I think that's where the future of phenomenology can be found. Topics like embodiment, but not only in the classical sense, but more so in a sense that extend to questions that are of interest for us today. And the body also figures as being of paramount importance for him. He wrote a book called Embodiments, From the Body to the Body Politic. And as he told me, he's right now working on a book that tries to understand how this question of the body relates to the question of God. So this only as a very short introduction. James, we are absolutely happy to have you among us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me? Yeah? I guess it's the microphone. Speak up. Oh, okay. So, just a tiny bit of background. I wrote this in between a couple of stays in the hospital because I had heart problems. So I was thinking about suffering at that time. And I had just read Levinas's Non-Useless Suffering. So what does it mean to suffer? How are we to understand the sufferings we undergo? Is there a sense, a purpose to them? Or is the very passivity implied in the word to suffer, which etymologically signifies to undergo and endure, something that robs suffering of all inherent meaning? Levinas, in his article Useless Suffering, argues, and I'm quote, in fact the rest what I say is going to be quotes. Useless suffering argues that intrinsically suffering is useless, for nothing. It exhibits a depth of meaningless that repels any sense we could attach to it. He remarks further that while, and I'm quoting, suffering is a datum in consciousness, it is nonetheless unassumable. We cannot synthesize such data into a one in many, that is, a common sense that would apply to the data. Suffering is not simply a symptom of the rejection of the synthesis of the Kantian I think. It is this rejection itself, end of quote. As such, and I continue to quote, it is the denial, the refusal of meaning, thrusting itself forward as a sensible quality. What we experience in suffering, according to Levinas, is a pure passivity, one that is not for the sake, one that is not the other side of any activity. Thus, normally, the receptivity or passivity of our senses is already active reception. The data that we receive are synthesized and are part of the actual perceptual process. Here, however, what we experience is, and I quote again, the concreteness of the not, a negativity extending as far as to the realm of unmeaning. It is the unmeaning absurdity of suffering that makes it intrinsically useless. In this paper, I shall argue against this interpretation. My claim will be that suffering, in its suspension of synthesis, exhibits a meaning beyond meaning, one embodied in the unique singularity of our flesh. This uniqueness is, in fact, an interruption. It signifies the suspension of all systems of exchange, all attempts to render good for good or evil for evil. It is in terms of such a suspension that suffering, particularly it's found in selfless sacrifice, finds its use. It is not non-useless. First section. Suffering and Theodicy. Historically, the question of suffering is tied to Theodicy. In the monotheistic religions, which see God not only as the creator, but also as the ruler of the world, the question becomes that of his tolerance of evil. Hume, in his dialogues, puts this in terms of a series of alternatives. And I quote, "Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's impotent. Is he able to prevent evil but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil?" Right? That's from the ancient Stoic. Something here has to give. To explain evil, we seem to have to abandon God's power, or his goodness, or his intelligibility. The last alternative is included since, as Hans Jonas writes, only a completely unintelligible God can be said to be absolutely good and absolutely powerful, yet tolerate the world as it is, unquote. The world that is marked by the frequency of suffering. The classic answer to this impasse is to understand suffering in terms of an economy or system of exchange. Individuals within society live by exchanging goods and services. Legal systems defend the social order by imposing fines or other penalties on those who violate its rules. Here the exchange is one of penalties for misdeeds, evils for evils. Given the pervasiveness of the economy in our lives, it seems natural to apply this relation to God. This thought, in fact, is not limited to the monotheistic creeds. Plato brings it up in a dialogue where Socrates asks the priest about the nature of piety. The priest describes piety as care for the gods. Prayer and sacrifice are what we offer to the gods. In return, they provide us with their benefits. As Socrates sums up this position, and I quote, "Piety would then be a sort of trading skill between gods and men, one involving a mutual exchange of benefits," unquote. To explain suffering in such a context, one need only extend this exchange to include penalties. God not only returns good for good, but also evil for evil. As Levinas remarks, such a view, and I quote, "is as old as a certain reading of the Bible. It dominates the consciousness of believers who explain their misfortunes by reference to sin, or at least to their sins," unquote. This, for example, is the view of Job's comforters. In the book of Job, they claim Job, and I quote, "cheated orphan children of their rights. He was," and I quote, "led astray by riches, or corrupted by fat bribes," unquote. That's why he suffers. God, in fact, and I continue to quote, "saves the wretched by their very wretchedness and uses distress to open their eyes." Job, however, insists on his innocence. He says, "God knows I am innocent. If he sifts me," he asserts, "I will shine like gold," right? He's like the gold in the pan that you separate the sand from. Since we do see the innocent suffer and see that the wicked flourish, prosperity and power cannot, he argues again and again, be the sign of goodness. Neither can suffering be a penalty for evil doing. At the end of the book of Job, God affirms that Job, unlike the comforters, has, and I quote, spoken truthfully about me. But if this is so, what sense can be made of innocent suffering? How can we understand it in terms of an economy or an exchange? One way to do so is to acknowledge that debts need not be paid by those who incurred them. A friend can pay off a friend's debt. A father can pay a son's traffic fine. If we apply this to our commerce with God, we can see suffering as a recompense, a payment by the innocent for the guilty. This seems to be the conception behind Isaiah's depiction of the suffering servant, who is reckoned amongst the transgressors because of what he endured. In fact, however, and I quote, he was pierced through for our transgressions, tortured for our iniquities. It is, unquote, it is according to Isaiah, by his scourging that we are healed. He pays our debt. In this exchange, and I quote again, himself bearing the penalty of their guilt, the servant bore the sins of many, unquote. Paul in his epistles imports this view to describe the passion. According to Paul, quote, God designated Christ to be the means of expiating sin by his sacrificial death. And so far as Christ died for his sins, he pays the penalty that God imposed upon us. Right? That's from Corinthians. The sentiment here is the same as that of the prophets, who saw the misfortunes of Israel as punishment for our sins. What Paul does is combine this view with Isaiah's conception of the suffering servant. Christ, like the servant, pays the debt. He squares our accounts with God, our creditor. To the impartial observer, this economic view of suffering suffers from two overriding difficulties. The first difficulty is that it reifies the relationship between God and mankind, making it one of debt and credit. Right? In this exchange, suffering takes on the role of a currency. Now, money is indifferent to those who employ it. I can pay for my meal, but you can also pay for it. It makes no difference as long as the bill is paid. Suffering, however, is the opposite of this indifference. It is always personal. At the extreme, it nails one to one's flesh, the very flesh that makes a person himself and not someone else. I mean, if you've ever experienced pain like I did last year, you find yourself contracting into yourself. The world becomes smaller until it's just yourself. At extreme, it nails one to the flesh, the very flesh that makes a person himself and not someone else. It is as little transferable as one's organic body. Given this, it's inherently incapable of serving as a neutral currency. The second difficulty is that this economic explanation makes God the Father a moral monster. No moral being would treat his son that way. If I'm angry at something for something that he has done, how would it make sense to take my anger out on my own son? Okay, second section, flesh. For Levinas and Jonas, the events of the Holocaust spend the end of this economic view of suffering. In Levinas's words, and I quote, "It renders impossible and odious every proposal and every thought that would explain it by the sins of those who have suffered or are dead," unquote. No sins could justify the atrocities the Jews suffered at the hands of the Nazis. The problem, in fact, is not the imbalance. It is the very attempt to understand suffering in terms of an economy. For Derrida, in fact, the whole economic interpretation of God's relationship to believers witnesses, and I quote, "the irreducible experience of belief between credit and faith, believing suspended between credit, créance, and the creditor, créancier, Gläubiger, and the credit croyance, Glauben of the believer, croyant. All those foreign words are in the text, foreign to me. He asked, how can one believe this history of credence or credit? If this account is unbelievable, what is the alternative? Is there a sense to expiatory suffering that avoids the conception of an exchange? Is there a way to understand Christ as exemplifying the suffering servant without turning his Father into a moral monster? As Levinas correctly observes, suffering is characterized by passivity, exposure, and openness. It exhibits flesh before the synthesis of the ego, before, in fact, any expression of the self's autonomy. How can we understand the flesh that is thus regarded? One answer comes from the fact that flesh is at the basis of one's being oneself rather than another. It expresses what cannot be transferred to another. Such non-transferability shows itself in our organic function. Heidegger remarked that each of us must die our own death. No one can do this for another. Death, of course, is a cessation of the functioning of our flesh. Such functioning is inherently non-substitutable. Thus, no one can eat for you, sleep for you, breathe for you, or perform for you any of your bodily functions. Now, as non-transferable, the functioning that makes us unique is inherently incapable of participating in an economy. And that's one of the points that Shakespeare makes in The Merchant of Venice, when in fact the debt is for a pound of flesh. But of course that cannot be repaid. It's outside of the economy, and part of Shakespeare's point here is that there is a limitation to economy and to being a merchant. Anyway, so the suffering, now is non-transferable. The functioning that makes us unique is inherently incapable of participating in an economy. So it's the suffering of the flesh that functions. This, as I indicated, is why suffering cannot act as a currency. The reason why we hardly ever grasp this non-transferability is that the flesh that is uniquely our own escapes all conceptualization. As unique, its ontological status is not that of being a one amongst many possible examples, each of which is essentially substitutable for another, like, for example, apples in a store. Having many instances of this fruit, we can draw from them a number of common features and express them with common meanings. Right? The flesh that incarnates us, however, is exhibited in only one example. It exists not as one amongst many, that is a countable singular, but rather as uniquely one. So regarded, it cannot be defined in our subtle sense. We cannot understand it in terms of species and genus. We can only directly sense it, right? That's from the metaphysics. In fact, it is inexpressible in the common meanings of our language, which by definition apply as common to more than one object. What then is the flesh that suffering exposes, the flesh that incarnates each of us? To borrow a term from Nietzsche, we confront here universalia ante rem, universals before the thing. Concepts are universalia post rem, universals after the thing, right? We need a bunch of things to grasp their common features. They are universals that we draw after we regard similar individuals. The flesh that each of us directly encounters is, however, before such individuals. Final section, flesh and forgiveness. Does this mean that we embrace Levinas's position that the suffering is intrinsically useless? Does suffering's reduction of a person to his flesh taken as before the synthesis of the ego, leave us with the absurdity, the lack of sense of suffering? Is suffering so regarded useless, for nothing? If we mean by for nothing its economic value, the answer is certainly affirmative. As we have seen, the senselessness of flesh is rooted in its uniqueness. It is a function of its non-substitutability, its inability to enter into any systems of exchange. In fact, flesh qua flesh is the interruption of all systems of exchange, be they the return of goods for goods or the rendering of suffering for misdeeds. As I mentioned, that's the point of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, the failure of the debt. Yeah? This inability to participate in an economy does not, however, imply that suffering is useless. Its use is, in fact, in its interruption of the economy. This can be put in terms of the Passion of Christ. His suffering and death on the cross is senseless when regarded in terms of the economy. This is not simply because it has no use within it, it's because it exists as a denial of this economy. In fact, his claim to see God on the cross, God in the form of suffering flesh, is a claim to regard him as outside of this economy. It is to assert that he is present as the interruption of this economy, the interruption of the very system of exchange by which Paul attempts to interpret Christ's sacrifice. The concrete expression of such an interruption is the forgiveness that Christ expresses. Regarding his crucifiers, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." Forgiveness is an abandonment of the economy that exchanges evil for evil. It's outside the system of credit and creditor that's associated with belief. A similar abandonment occurs at the end of Job, when God, having affirmed Job's words, has Job pray that his friends be forgiven for not speaking truthfully about God. Right? Job has to intercede for them, for their error was to think of God in terms of an economy, the very economy that Job denied. Where do we get the basis for such forgiveness? How is it possible for humans who are meshed in and live from a system of exchanges with one another to transcend the economy? An answer can be found in Abraham's pleading for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Again and again, Abraham intercedes for them. He gets God to pardon the place if there are first 50 good men in the city, then 45, then 40, then 30, then 20, and finally, if 10 can be found there. What is striking in this pleading is Abraham's remark, "May I presume to speak to the Lord, dust and ashes that I am," unquote. How is this basis for his pleading for this? How is this, being dust and ashes, a basis for his pleading for the city's pardon? According to Genesis, the city's sins merited its destruction. The economy of misdeed and penalty was clear. Such an economy, however, is interrupted by flesh, by the very flesh that Abraham references in speaking himself as dust and ashes. This indicates that the basis for forgiveness is our flesh, the very flesh that Christ assumes in the incarnation. Anselm of Canterbury, writing in his book, Why God Became Man, Codeus Homo, writes, "It is not," I quote, "it is not right to cancel sin without compensation or punishment. God, having assumed flesh, takes this on for us. His suffering is sufficient to compensate for our sins." The alternative view which I'm suggesting is that God becomes man in order to interrupt this economy. His purpose is to present ourselves as ourselves apart from it, apart from the economy. The presentation of creation and forgiveness. This presentation of ourselves as distinct from the world's economy is implicit in the creation story of Genesis. In this account, God creates the world not from some pre-existing matter, but rather ab novo. If we accept this, then neither God nor his action are bound by the world, since both are prior to it. Insofar as Genesis asserts 3 times that we are created in the image of God, this in some measure also holds for us. The question this raises has long vexed theology. How are we to understand the transcendence implicit in our being created in the image and likeness of God? Does it imply that we, like God, are somehow immaterial, that we display an immunity to being determined by the world? The facts of mortality, more generally of embodiment, argue against this. We share with other living creatures the pleasures and vicissitudes of flesh. Like them, we are immersed in the economy of the world. The very notion of metabolism, in German Stoffwechsel, or exchange of material, implies such an economy. We breathe and exchange carbon dioxide for oxygen. Like other animals, we live from the world, both conditioning and being conditioned by the world. What then is our claim to be the image of God? In what sense do we share God's priority to the world and to its economy? An answer can be found by returning to the book of Job. At the beginning of this book, God makes a wager with Satan, the adversary or accusing angel. God praises Job as a man, quote, of blameless and upright life. Satan, in reply, asserts that Job's goodness is motivated by the benefits he receives in turn. Satan says, "Has not Job good reason to be God-fearing? Have you not hedged him round on every side with your protection? Him and his family and all his possessions? Whatever he does, you have blessed, and his herds have increased beyond measure." If, however, God withdraws such benefits, then I quote, "then he will curse you to your face." The wager then is that the wager then is that Job's goodness is simply a function of the economy. His goodness is dependent on the benefits he receives. So far as his relationship to God is a relation to such benefits, it's simply transactional. God accepts this wager and tells Satan, "All that he has is in your hands." Satan accordingly destroys Job's wealth and family, leaving only his wife alive. Job, however, does not curse God. Rather, he proclaims, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Satan next induces God to let him ruin Job's health. He says to God, "But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh and see if he will not curse you to your face." Still, however, Job maintains his integrity. He does not curse God. He does not return evil for evil. Reduced to his suffering flesh, he's placed outside of the economy. The flesh that incarnates him can offer nothing to the economy. It is useless for nothing. Job, however, claims, "If he sifts me, I will shine." What shines through is the very basis for his forgiveness. That the interruption of the economy exhibited by his flesh is also a manifestation of his transcendence as God's image. Right? So it's at that point he can pray, he can intercede for his friends for their forgiveness. Such transcendence does not deny, but rather is based upon the embodiment that enmeshes us in the world. The economy that reaches to the physicality of our flesh, our need for food, clothing, and shelter, exceeds the sense that structures the economy's exchange. It exhibits that which transcends the economy. This transcendence appears in Matthew's account of those who will be admitted to Christ's kingdom when he comes in his glory. They are those who fed him when he was hungry, who gave him drink when he was thirsty, who clothed him when he was naked, who made him welcome when he was a stranger, who visited him when he was in prison. When asked by the elect, "When did we do this?" Christ replied, "When they did it to one of the very least." Right? Any to a lot to. That is, to the hungry, the naked, rejected of society. The objects of their attentions were precisely those who had nothing to offer the exchange economy, those who were useless for nothing. Christ's presence as such is his presence prior to the world. He exhibits his identity with God the Creator in giving himself as not being able to be given in terms of this economy. In identifying himself with the powerless, the helpless, and the vulnerable. Okay? If we accept this, then the incarnation appears as a kenosis, an emptying out. In Paul's words, God, in incarnating himself, made himself nothing, assuming the nature of a slave, unquote. The completion of this self-emptying is Christ's appearance on the cross. At the end of his earthly life, he appears as the wretched creature who cries out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" In Christ's very nakedness and exposure, and his having absolutely nothing to offer this earthly economy, Christians are supposed to see God. What they view, in fact, is his reduction to suffering flesh. This is the flesh that is uniquely singular, the flesh that is not one among many, but uniquely one. Christ here exhibits the singularity that all monotheistic relations claim for God. This is the singularity that we all share as God's likeness. It's a singularity that, in its interruption of every economy, opens the way for forgiveness.
Thank you very much, James, for sharing your interpretation of Levinas's text and all the implications that you've drawn from that. The floor is open for questions, remarks.
Thank you for a beautiful paper. I'm just curious, does a sort of spiritual or emotional suffering connect with the physical suffering, and in what way? Because oftentimes, obviously, we have profound emotional experience, they're very embodied, but I'm wondering if the shareability of a experience that can be communicated more clearly would change anything that you said.
I don't know, I think that profound mental distress is also extremely isolating, and you know, you really can't talk about it. I mean, and not being able to talk about it is part of the distress. And I think that's a distress that shows the bodily origin of one's emotional life, you know? I mean, the worst thing you can do with somebody is, if they have a problem of that nature, is to offer a solution. The best thing you can do is listen.
Thank you, James, for this beautiful, inspiring lecture. I think what you offered is really a very good way how to give sense to something that seems to have no sense. What I was thinking was the question about the suffering of the other, of another, because just because of this very uniqueness. So if we endure the suffering, it's something that, you know, it's so ours. And what about look at the suffering of someone else and you know, how to relate to that? Because you said already now not to give advices, but because that's precisely the problem of, you know, innocent people who suffer. How do we then relate to it? One thing is Jesus asking for forgiveness. You know, everyone of us in our uniqueness is called to transcend, so to speak, himself or to be in the likeness of God. You know, precisely the suffering.
Well, of course, you know, and the useless suffering, Levinas claims that the only thing way in which suffering can have meaning is in terms of the suffering of the other, and then it calls us to act. I think that my sense is that a real experience of suffering of the other is almost a matter of interjection. I mean, one suffers in the other with the other, you know? And that's a remarkable form of transcendence. That's that universality before things that gives us an identity. I mean, I was once in the Paris metro, and the metro suddenly lurched, you know, and I fell forward, you know, and there was a metal bar there, you know, and everybody thought, I think, I was going to hit it. And I looked at the carriage and everybody winced. I mean, it was a remarkable thing to see this collective action, you know. And I didn't hit myself, you know, I didn't hurt myself. But it was as if they were all in me. You know, that's that example of the universal before the thing. That we have that capacity of empathy. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I was quite moved by the conclusion. My question regards the phenomenological definition of suffering. So if suffering is what exceeds the economy, is any kind of suffering that is done for the sake of something else than not truly suffering? So for example, if I'm, let's say, training for an athletic contest and I undergo certain pain to achieve, you know, a good outcome, is that really not suffering because it's involved in the acquisition of something else? So is there I guess my question is there a limitation of the definition of suffering that's kind of implied in your talk?
I think that's there are two senses of the body. Okay, there is the body as participating in an economy. You know, someone else can clean my house for me, right? And there is the body in performing acts. In the I can, you know, somebody else can run that race, you know, and that's certainly true. And that, as Levinas says, is the body in the active. So that my notion of suffering is taken from Levinas here as a passivity. You know, I suffer every time I have to mow the bloody lawn, right? And it's hot. But that's not a useless suffering, is it? You know? Well, it is because the weeds come up. But that's how I guess I would say, though that's an excellent question. It gives me things to think of. But I talking about suffering here as a passive undergoing.
Thank you for the quoting of here you made in your lesson. Because this is one of the famous biblical texts where we say no model of theodicy functions. And the end of Hiob reported is
Could you speak?
The friends of Hiob are not right, and the answer of God in the interpretation from Christoph Dohlmann or Schlievers Schönberger is the vision of God. Hiob sees
Hell. Hell, you mean? Hell. Hölle.
He sees God. It's the vision of God at the end of him. And this is a crazy end of Hiob. Job. Job. Because Job doesn't get an answer, but the revelation by the face of God, who is reserved for only a few people. And now I have the following question. because also in theology, sin and forgiveness. We know that sins are forgiven by Jesus and by God. And St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, says, if there is sin, and then we get the grace, then there is a necessary link between sin and forgiveness. And then in Romans 5 chapter, St. Paul says, does it mean that we have to make more and more sins so that we can get more and more grace? Or the exultate with the Easter liturgy. Oh, happy sin. Not happy day, but happy sin. Because you brought us salvation. So how can we deal with this item so that we not fall in the mistake to make a necessary link between sin and forgiveness, and to show that this forgiveness, we hope that it comes, that we have no secure knowledge, oh wonderful, I'm a sinner and I will get this grace, not, I agree with you, not in the speech of economics, like our economy in the world, but the economy where it's a free given forgiveness, but we can't live without it. That's my problem also as theologian. Sorry that I take this question to you.
Well, I guess two things. First, let me speak about Job. I mean, traditionally, Job is thought of as a defense of creation. You know? It's a kind of answer to best of all is not to have been born, by Sophocles. And the defense is rather weird. He points out to the ostrich. And the ostrich is the stupidest of animals. He steps on his eggs, etc., and so forth. And yet the ostrich is making it. He's succeeding. And they're pointing out to all of these creatures who are, pretty inept. And they're all making it. And I think that vision is that the world has got in itself resources. And that its very existence as flesh, as embodied creation, is an existence of resources, that the world too shines if you sift it. And that the vision of God the parallel would be the vision of the shield that Achilles carries at the end of the Iliad, when he stands on the wall with the new shield that his mother, Thetis, gives him, where you see all the activities of man, from the wedding feast to the burial to war, whatever, and he's bearing the world on his shield. And the vision there is that as a whole, it makes sense. The parallel vision is that, if you look at the world, in all of its creatures, it does make sense. Even the ostrich is okay, no matter how stupid she is or he is. But the second thing about Paul and grace and freedom, I think that grace is, of course, a denial of the economy. But the idea that let's sin more so we'll have more grace is once again shoving it back into the economy. I think, and that whole nation, I have the sense that, we continuously slide off the fact of the incarnation. Paul makes a very strong distinction between pneuma and psyche. And psyche is the breath that makes a body alive. Right? And I think we forget that. We take the road of Platonism and think of ourselves as psyche rather than a pneuma. And so perhaps the vision of God is a vision of that pneuma.
Thank you very much for your lecture. You cited Hans Jonas.
Yeah,
And
that's from God after Auschwitz, yeah.
And his problem was the relationship between the senseless suffering and the Almighty God.
Right.
And he resolved this problem by the statement that God cannot be Almighty or concepted as Almighty anymore. And do you think that this idea of Hans Jonas is still within the economy of suffering or not?
Well, I think the real problem is the following: to think of the power of God in terms of the economy. Look, I studied with Emil Fackenheim, and he once is a Jewish philosopher that taught Hegel at the University of Toronto for years. Anyway, he had this wonderful kind of idea that was stuck with me. He said, you look at the miracles in the Bible, you know. He even wrote a lecture on this called Elijah and the Empiricist. You look at the miracles in the Bible and they're always followed by unbelief. You know, so Elijah, you know, gets his pyre, they pour water on it, you know, and it bursts into flames. The other people, you know, do all this kind of stuff. And 3 chapters later, everybody's worshiping Baal. It's as if they didn't see anything. And, you know, why is that? Well, because, in fact, something that happens in the world and expressed in worldly power can have a worldly cause, right? What did I think the first time I heard it? He must have found some form of gasoline that he poured on the fire, you know? I mean, Christ healed the sick, but modern medicine does a really good job, right? And, you know, I mean, the person who really performed a lot of miracles, look what happened to him. He wound up on the cross. So what is the point of that? The point of that is simply that as soon as we think of power in worldly terms, we reduce God to something in the world. You know, and Kierkegaard makes this point, you know, we have to respect that the God who created the world is not limited by worldly conditions and not defined by worldly conditions. And that for God to appear in the world as he is in himself, as prior to the world, is for him to appear as devoid of those worldly conditions of power and might. So Christ's 3 temptations are to do something. Turn bread into stones, cast himself down off, you know, get himself worshipped. The 3 temptations of Christ are for Christ to express himself and his divinity in worldly terms. And of course, that's what Pontius Pilate wants. He keeps on saying to Christ, you are the King of the Jews, right? And he puts it on the cross. That makes it a political rebellion and a political crime and, you know, an alternate sovereignty which we can punish in a worldly way. And Christ, the dialogue is Christ is saying, no, that's you're mistaken. You know, but that's the temptation, is for us all to be Pontius Pilate and put God into that, you know, power and might. I mean, that's the problem with some evangelical sects in the United States.
My question is, how is it possible to reinterpret the suffering of Christ in the way of the suffering in Levinas? And I explain this point, which is very important for me related. It seems to me, as you said, that the definition of suffering has impossibility of retreat in Levinas, which is an animal suffering. When Levinas explained that the first suffering is the physical one and not the moral one. I think it's absolutely new when he wrote that in front of spiritualism and so on. First. Then, my first idea or interpretation is to say that perhaps it's possible to reinterpret the suffering of the Christ on the cross in that way. It means that suffering is not first a sort of expression, but for the Christ on the cross, it is also a sort of impossibility of retreat, as you said. It means it is only a body's experience. And it's not first a spiritual experience. And that's why he cried, and as says St. Paul, when he cried, the veil of the temple, I know that was short in two, déchiré en deux, and St. Paul said, and the veil of the temple was his body. So it is his body. Then my question is the sense of suffering the same in a Jewish perspective or in the Levinas perspective and in a Christian perspective? Why? Because the difficulty in the Levinas corpus, I think, books, is to link this conception of suffering in his first book, the time and the order and so on, and the question of the responsibility for the order. You find it later. Because Levinas said, we are all the Messiah, because the Messiah didn't came in Judaism. And that's why I have to bear the responsibility for the order. And it means also, as you said, that I have to be or to share my suffering with the suffering of the order. Then it's possible to interpret Christianity in that way, to say that Christ bear our suffering or share our suffering. But in fact, and that is my question, I just put a few pages about it, but I never developed that interpretation. Can we speak about Christianity, about Christ? Can we speak about a responsibility for the order? It means that is Christ responsible for us? Or it seems to me that Christ is completely irresponsible and not responsible as a child. Why is he irresponsible? Because of Trinity. And that is a Christian interpretation. It means that Christ didn't bear our suffering. He didn't bear his suffering. But, that's my interpretation. But he said to his father, I can't bear their suffering, and I can't bear my suffering. So only one can bear my suffering, and their suffering is not me, but you, the father. And it means it's more difficult to be irresponsible than to be responsible. You see the point? And in that way, perhaps we can say that the sense of suffering changed in Christianity because of Trinity. Because Christ is not a sort of Promethean Savior who is bearing our suffering. In fact, because of Trinity, perhaps you can say that Christ is totally irresponsible, but the good irresponsibility, and Levinas spoke about the irresponsibility of the child. When he cried, he made the distinction between the sanglot, you say in English, when a child is crying, the sobbing of the child. And the sobbing of the child is not only to cry, something broke in myself. So you see the question? Interpretation. I did it in the Dwight of Gethsemane, but I don't know what you think about that.
I think that, no, I don't think, it's hard for me to speak about Jewish suffering. I do think that what breaks in from into the anonymous Ilya in Time and the Other is the other person, that he relieves the pressure of my being upon myself, that kind of suffocation. And in that sense, the other responds to the enclosure that I have, by offering me a way out. Now, for Christ, I think Christ is trying to say to us, well, let me put it this way. There are two types of evil. There are the evils that, happen, drop, thunderstorms, hurricanes, etc. They're natural evils, okay? And then there are the evils that we bring upon each other. And often those evils are a kind of involved in an economy. I mean, France wanted to get back at Germany for the seizure of Alsace and Lorraine, right? Germany wanted to get, let me start it again. Bismarck grabs Alsace and Lorraine, France gets it back, Germany gets it back again, France gets it back. You have got, what you have there is in that cycle you have an endless economy, right, of evil for evil. Or, and I have the sense that it is in terms of that form that we have to look at the Christian idea of getting out of the economy. Put it another way. Now, is that Jewish or not? The problem is that Jewish thought has been so corrupted by Christianity. Levinas is very much has many Christian themes in him. And to talk about Christianity is not a pure matter either, because it's been corrupted by Platonism. And how do you separate out the non-Platonic element without then getting it into the Jewish element? I'm wandering around trying to find an answer for you. I guess I would say that, the breaking of the economy really does involve what Hannah Arendt said as natality. Why is natality the answer? When she says a new generation contains within it the possibility of forgiveness, I think that's because of the new generation has that is itself an interruption by virtue of its embodiment. Okay, but I'm sorry I have not answered your question at all.
But I think you gave many answers to many interesting questions, and for that we would like to thank you very much.